Reggie Miller never needed size or raw power to leave his mark on basketball. What set him apart was timing, precision, and an iron will that never cracked under pressure. For nearly 2 decades with the Indiana Pacers, he became the face of clutch shooting, a 5-time All-Star who thrived when the moment was heaviest and the stakes could not be higher. His legend is forever tied to Madison Square Garden. New York despised him, and Miller relished every second of it. In the spring of 1995, he silenced the Garden with 8 points in 9 seconds, a sequence that felt like a script no writer could invent. He lived for those moments, feeding off the booze, turning pressure into performance. But even the sharpest shooter is defined by the battles that tested him most. Reggie Miller's story is written not just in his triumphs, but in the rivals who forced him to dig deeper. Behind every clutch shot stood defenders who refused to back down, superstars who carried their own legends, and opponents who made every point feel like survival. When Miller looks back, 7 names stand above the rest. They were the toughest, the ones who turned each matchup into a war of will and endurance. These 7 players were not just opponents, they were the crucible that shaped Reggie's legacy, the fire that hardened him into one of the most feared shooters the NBA has ever seen. This is the story of those 7 battles, and the men who made Reggie Miller's career unforgettable. Michael Jordan was the standard every player of the 1990s measured themselves against, and Reggie Miller was no exception. To face Jordan was to step into the spotlight of basketball's ultimate competitor. He was not only the most complete scorer of his generation, but also the fiercest closer the game had ever known. Every possession against him felt like walking a tightrope, with no margin for error. For Miller and the Indiana Pacers, the rivalry with Jordan reached its peak in the Eastern Conference Finals of 1998. Indiana had pushed Chicago to the brink, becoming one of the few teams bold enough to stare down the dynasty. In Game 4, Miller delivered one of his most iconic moments. With seconds left, he slipped free of Scottie Pippen's long arms and launched a deep three-pointer over Jordan's outstretched hand. The ball swished through the net, and the home crowd erupted. For that instant, Reggie had beaten the unbeatable. Yet Jordan's greatness was never about a single shot or a single moment. It was about the relentless way he reclaimed control. Even as Miller celebrated, Jordan responded with the calm of a champion, rallying his Bulls and guiding them to win the series in 7 games. For Reggie, it was both heartbreaking and illuminating. He had proven he could trade blows with the best, but he also learned why Jordan was different. He never let the weight of expectation break him. Looking back, Miller often admitted that Jordan brought out a version of himself he might never have discovered otherwise. The trash talk, the battles in crunch time, the sheer intensity, it all sharpened his edge. Facing Jordan was more than a test of skill, it was a test of heart, patience, and courage. For Reggie Miller, Michael Jordan was the toughest opponent of them all, the immovable obstacle who forced him to rise beyond his own limits. If Madison Square Garden was the theater, then John Starks was the enforcer who guarded its stage. As the fiery guard of the New York Knicks, Starks represented everything that made those battles with Reggie Miller unforgettable. He was fearless, scrappy, and never willing to concede an inch. Whenever Miller cut through screens or circled the perimeter looking for daylight, it was often Starks in his face, arms extended, voice raised, daring him to shoot. The rivalry between Miller and Starks came to life in the early and mid-1990s. The Knicks and Pacers collided year after year in the playoffs, with emotions running so high that every basket felt like an explosion. Starks embodied New York's toughness, a player undrafted out of college who had clawed his way into the league and wore his chip on his shoulder like armor. Against Reggie, that edge often turned into something more, a personal duel that seemed to ignite the entire Garden. The most iconic clash came during the 1994 playoffs. In Game 5, Miller stunned the crowd with 25 points in the fourth quarter, silencing a building that had mocked him all night. On the other end, Starks struggled, unable to contain Miller's rhythm. For Reggie, that quarter became a defining chapter. For Starks, it was a bitter reminder of how thin the line was between hero and villain in New York. Yet what made Starks such a tough opponent was not just his defense, but his will. He refused to back down, even when Miller was at his hottest. Their verbal exchanges, their shoves after the whistle, the sheer tension between them, it never really cooled. Starks turned every game into a battle of pride as much as skill. For Miller, John Starks was more than a rival, he was the living symbol of New York resistance. Facing him was like staring into the fire of the Garden itself. And that fire sharpened Reggie's edge, giving the world one of the most enduring rivalries of the decade. Patrick Ewing was the towering figure at the center of every New York Knicks battle. As the franchise cornerstone and one of the most dominant big men of his generation, Ewing carried the weight of an entire city on his shoulders. For Reggie Miller and the Indiana Pacers, he was the immovable wall that guarded Madison Square Garden, a presence that defined every playoff clash between the two teams. While John Starks brought fire on the perimeter, it was Ewing who anchored the Knicks with his scoring, rebounding, and unshakable leadership. Standing 7 feet tall, with a soft shooting touch and the ability to control the paint, he forced Miller and the Pacers to play with perfect precision. It was not enough to simply outshoot New York. To beat the Knicks, you had to go through Patrick Ewing. One of their most dramatic meetings came in the Eastern Conference Finals of 1995. The Pacers had pushed New York to a decisive Game 7, and Miller's heroics had carried Indiana that far. But in the Garden, with everything on the line, Ewing refused to surrender. He poured in points, grabbed rebounds, and controlled the flow of the game. When the final buzzer sounded, the Knicks advanced, and the Pacers were left with heartbreak. For Reggie, the defeat underscored just how tough Ewing was not only physically, but mentally, as the leader who embodied his team's grit. The battles with Ewing were not just about basketball, they were about pride, identity, and survival in the most intense arena in the league. Every time Miller rose for a shot, he knew Ewing's shadow loomed over the moment, even if the big man was not the one guarding him directly. To Reggie Miller, Patrick Ewing was the spirit of New York, the obstacle that tested his resilience and defined the rivalry between Pacers and Knicks. Facing him was like facing the Garden itself, loud, unforgiving, and endlessly determined. If Michael Jordan was the face of the Chicago Bulls dynasty, then Scottie Pippen was its backbone. Tall, rangy, and relentless on defense, Pippen was the player often assigned to shadow Reggie Miller. With his 7-foot wingspan and tireless motor, he turned every cut, every screen, and every catch into a struggle. For Miller, who thrived on freedom of movement, there were few defenders more suffocating than Pippen. Their clashes came to a head in the Eastern Conference Finals of 1998. The Pacers were one of the few teams brave enough to push the Bulls to 7 games, and Miller delivered some of his greatest performances in that series. Yet behind every three-pointer, behind every moment of space Miller carved out, stood Pippen, closing gaps with a single stride and contesting shots with arms that seemed to reach forever. One moment in Game 7 told the story best. Late in the fourth quarter, with Indiana desperate for points, Miller curled off a screen looking for his trademark jumper. Pippen fought through contact, stretched across the lane, and forced a miss that silenced Indiana's surge. It was not a highlight dunk or a flashy steal, but the kind of defensive play that defined Pippen's value, invisible to many, unforgettable to those facing him. For Miller, Pippen represented more than just a defensive assignment. He embodied the discipline and sacrifice that made Chicago untouchable for nearly a decade. To score on Jordan was hard enough, but to escape Pippen's grip possession after possession demanded patience, creativity, and unshakable focus. Looking back, Reggie often acknowledged that Pippen forced him to grow, to refine his movements, and to embrace the grind of being chased by one of the greatest defenders ever. If Jordan was the mountain of skill, Pippen was the storm that battered you until only your best remained. Allen Iverson arrived in the league like a lightning bolt, and for veterans like Reggie Miller, he represented both a challenge and a warning. Barely 6 feet tall but quicker than anyone else on the floor, Iverson redefined what a guard could do in the late 1990s. He attacked relentlessly, driving into the paint against bigger defenders, crossing over opponents so suddenly that crowds gasped in disbelief. For Miller, who relied on intelligence and precision, Iverson was the raw storm of youth and fearlessness. When the Pacers faced the Philadelphia 76ers, Miller often watched Iverson take over games with an energy that felt unstoppable. There were nights when Iverson scored over 40 points, his jumpers falling, his drives slicing through defenses like a blade. Even though Miller was not always his primary defender, he felt the weight of Iverson's presence. Every possession forced the Pacers to adjust, to trap, to rotate faster, because if you gave Iverson a sliver of space, he would make you pay. One particular clash in the late 90s stood out. Iverson shredded Indiana's defense with a barrage of mid-range jumpers and fearless attacks at the rim. Reggie poured in points of his own, hitting deep shots to keep the Pacers in the fight, but he admitted afterward that Iverson's relentlessness was exhausting. It was as if every trip down the floor demanded maximum effort just to keep pace with the younger star. For Miller, Iverson symbolized the game's future, quicker, flashier, and unafraid of any stage. The battles between them were not personal grudges but tests of endurance, youth challenging experience, fearlessness pressing against composure. Looking back, Reggie often spoke with respect about Allen Iverson. He knew that the young guard's fire forced him to summon every ounce of his own toughness. To face Iverson was to be reminded that the NBA never stood still, and that every era produced its own kind of relentless warrior. By the year 2000, a new star had already begun to rise, and his name was Kobe Bryant. For Reggie Miller, Kobe was unlike many of the veterans he had faced. Young, fearless, and already brimming with confidence, Bryant carried himself as if the big stage belonged to him. At just 21 years old, he was already part of a championship contender with the Los Angeles Lakers, and he relished every opportunity to prove himself against established legends like Miller. The defining clash came in the NBA Finals of 2000. The Pacers, led by Miller, had finally reached the biggest stage, only to face the formidable duo of Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant. Game 4 became the turning point. With Shaq fouled out in overtime, the weight of the Lakers' offense fell on Kobe's shoulders. Instead of shrinking under the pressure, the young guard delivered. He hit clutch jumper after clutch jumper, silencing the Indiana crowd and showing the world that he was ready for greatness. For Miller, watching Kobe in those moments was both humbling and inspiring. He had built his career on thriving under pressure, but now he was staring at a younger version of that same mentality, fearless, composed, and cold-blooded when the clock ran down. Every shot Kobe hit that night carved a permanent place in Miller's memory, not as a wound but as a lesson in how the game constantly renewed itself with new warriors. Kobe was tough not only because of his skill, but because of his mindset. He carried himself with the poise of someone who believed he was destined to dominate, and he proved it against veterans who had seen it all. For Reggie, Kobe Bryant represented the future of toughness in the NBA, a player who would never back down, no matter the stage or the opponent. Facing Kobe was like looking into a mirror of his younger self, only sharper, stronger, and ready to take the torch. And for Miller, that made Kobe one of the toughest battles of his storied career. Gary Payton was known as the Glove, and for good reason. He wrapped himself around opponents with a suffocating defense that made even the best shooters uncomfortable. For Reggie Miller, who thrived on rhythm and freedom of movement, Payton was one of the toughest assignments he ever faced. Every time Miller tried to curl off a screen or slide into open space, Payton was there, bodying him, talking to him, reminding him that nothing would come easy. Their meetings in the 1990s were battles not just of skill but of will. The Seattle Supersonics carried a reputation for relentless defense, and Payton was the captain of that identity. He pressed full court, hounded ball handlers, and disrupted the Pacers' flow before Reggie could even catch the ball. The trash talk was constant, not crude or reckless, but sharp enough to get under your skin. For Miller, who thrived on psychological warfare himself, facing Payton was like looking into a mirror of intensity. One game in particular stood out when the Sonics forced Miller into a nightmare of contested shots. Payton shadowed him from the opening tip, bumping him off screens, contesting every release, and barking with every miss. Reggie still found ways to score, but he admitted that every point against Payton felt heavier, as though the basket had shrunk. The mental toll was as punishing as the physical. What separated Payton from so many others was his combination of defense and leadership. He demanded the best from himself and his teammates, and that energy spread throughout the Sonics. Miller respected that deeply. Even if the Pacers managed to beat Seattle, Payton's presence left Reggie drained, tested, and reminded of what true defensive excellence looked like. For Reggie Miller, Gary Payton was the embodiment of toughness on the perimeter. He turned basketball into a mental chess match, one where every move had to be planned, and every mistake was punished. Facing the Glove was never just another game, it was survival against one of the greatest defenders the NBA had ever seen. When the story of Reggie Miller is told, it is impossible to separate his triumphs from the rivals who shaped him. Michael Jordan tested his will, John Starks fueled unforgettable battles, Patrick Ewing embodied the pride of New York, Scottie Pippen smothered him with defense, Allen Iverson reminded him of the game's future, Kobe Bryant mirrored his own fearlessness, and Gary Payton turned every possession into a mental war. Each name carried its own challenge, and together they forged the edge that made Miller one of the greatest clutch shooters in NBA history. For Reggie, toughness was never just about points or highlights. It was about facing legends who refused to give an inch, and rising to meet them anyway. Which of these players do you believe was truly the toughest challenge for Reggie Miller? Don't forget to like, share your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories from basketball's golden era.